The Goose family moves next door. This spring, a very fortunate event occurred. Mr. and Mrs. C. Goose moved into the pond just southwest of Graham and Grandpa's house. For the past 3 years, they had taken up residence at Dave Ferry's pond, about a mile away. Graham and Grandpa kept track of the geese every day on their morning walks. They watched and waited impatiently for the geese to return. Early the first spring, it was just Mr. and Mrs. Goose who Graham and Grandpa named, Gordon and Gwen. But later in the spring, their family grew. Mrs. Goose, or Gwen, had given birth to 6 goslings. Gwen was very proud of each and every one of her little goslings, and she was quite sure that hers were the most beautiful to be hatched so far this season. They were each perfectly fluffy with their soft down feathers, with just a touch of yellow that Gwen knew would soon turn gray as they grew up too quickly. Gwen took great pride in waddling around the pond with her line of goslings in tow. Both she and Gordon never missed a chance to brag about what accomplished swimmers each of their offspring were, even at such a young age. Now, Gwen and Gordon were both, by nature, very friendly and easygoing geese, but they could become extremely persuasive if anyone or anything got too near their goslings. One day, while the little ones were swimming across the pond with Gwen, Gordon noticed a sly red fox skulking around the edge of the woods near the pond. Gordon, being bigger of the two, took off after the fox, honking and flapping his huge wings, which actually spanned nearly 6 feet. And Mr. Fox took off at a fast trot, looking over his shoulder only once to see just how close Gordon was to nipping the white fur of his tail. Gordon was always on the lookout for any predators that might harm his sweet babies. These included the snowy owls, eagles, which had recently come back to the neighborhood, and the nighttime visitors, coyotes. However, once the goslings were bigger, Gordon and Gwen wouldn't have to worry quite so much about their safety. And my, were they growing quickly. Gwen and Gordon savored every minute with their little goslings because they knew it wouldn't be long before they weren't so little anymore. This was becoming more and more apparent as their sweet yellow down was turning grayer in color, their necks were getting longer, and they were becoming more independent. Gwen knew she needed to let them explore more on their own, but it was hard watching her babies grow up so quickly. All of the goslings took after Mom and Dad with their love of seeds and berries, but their very favorite thing to do was stick their heads as far underwater as they could to eat the yummy plants under the surface. Gwen suspected this might have something to do with them then being able to splash all the water on their feathers on each other and, of course, their mom and dad. As sweet as they were, and as much as Gwen loved each and every one, they could be naughty just like any children. But the naughtiest by far was Gustav. Now, you need to know that all of the goslings were lovely, smart, and strong, but Gustav was the biggest, brightest, and strongest of all 6, and unfortunately, he was quite aware of his exceptional qualities. The youngsters were not yet looking identical to their parents, as their heads and necks were not quite black and their white chin straps had not emerged. However, the time for molting, when geese shed their old feathers to make way for new growth, was nearly over, which meant that the goslings were going to learn to fly. Gustav was the most excited of all to try out his new feathers and amazing wings and take to the air. Even though Gwen had been very clear in her warnings to her 6 offspring, they were not to fly on their own. Gustav decided to sneak away one day and see if he could take flight. Gustav, being the brightest gosling that he was, thought that a soft landing was probably key in the event of a mid-air disaster, so he searched around the pond to find the safest spot to practice. Gustav had decided that if he could get high enough, he could jump and try out his wings and hopefully fly. He had seen plenty of baby birds try it from trees, and it seemed to work for them. But what Gustav didn't know was that these geese learn to take off from the water because they're much heavier than baby birds, and jumping was not going to work. Without this knowledge, though, Gustav was convinced that the large branch hanging over the pond was going to be the place he learned how to fly and be the first of his siblings to gain his freedom in the air. As soon as the coast was clear, Gustav snuck away from his brothers and sisters and waddled as fast as his little goose legs could carry him over to the tree. Now, this branch started pretty close to the ground, but got higher as it went out over the pond. With a bit of struggle, Gustav was able to hop onto the branch, and then he very carefully walked, step by step, higher and higher out to the end of it. Once Gustav was in position, he knew in his heart that he would be able to leap, flap his wings, and go soaring into the air. He was more than excited. The brave young gosling took a deep breath and leapt off of the branch. Gustav flapped his young wings as hard as he could, and at first he was certain he was going to fly. But the water started getting closer and closer to him until he landed with a loud splash right into the pond. Oh, he was so embarrassed he could barely look at his siblings, who was sure had seen the whole thing take place. Little did Gustav know that despite all his quiet and secretive planning, his mom had known about his plan the whole time. She also knew that his plans were completely harmless, although she had kept a watchful eye over the whole thing, and she chuckled to herself when his plan had ended in him belly flopping into the water. Gustav slowly swam back over to his siblings, readying himself for all of the teasing he was sure he was about to get. But instead of teasing his siblings began excitedly asking him what it felt like to jump into the water like that. They thought that it was a game he had invented. Gustav smiled to himself as he began to proudly explain how he'd come up with such a fun game for everyone to participate in. The young goslings spent many fine, warm, sunny days jumping into the pond. Gwen and Gordon were so proud of their creativity. However, once the time came for the goslings to really learn to fly, Gordon and Gwen earnestly showed their children how to begin swimming as quickly as possible, and then arch out of the water, flap their wings, and finally take flight. It took a number of tries, but eventually they all learned to be excellent flyers, which was important, for once fall came, they would be taking a long journey south. This was a good thing, however. They did not have to split up, for Mother and Father Geese mate for life, and luckily their young live with them for the entire first year. The upcoming fall trip south and the winter months would be another amazing adventure.